Whole Foods, Whole People, Whole Story, a social structural analysis of green gentrification. Philosopher Sally Haslanger addresses the tendency we have to explain harms with biological or individualistic factors, but these harms cannot be understood in isolation from larger social structures. We will apply Eastwood and Smith's framework of social structures, which span individuals, persist over time, and constrain and enable people's choices and actions within a social environment. The social element involves mutually enforced rules, shared representations, and networks of relations. These 3 R's can suggest that we, as members of the social environment, have a moral obligation to consider and address causes and consequences of food injustice and gentrification. Perceptions of a healthy environment are dictated in large part by food systems, which are products of social and economic structures and representations of racial exclusion, greenlining, and food insecurity. Unjust harms surface in the displacement of low-income minority communities, while affluent white communities enter and benefit from such revitalized urban spaces.
Race is one of the biggest factors in the disparate reactions to and effects of gentrification. In Jacqueline Huang's article, The Social Construction of a Gentrifying Neighborhood, she found that residents living in the same spatial areas socially construct their neighborhood identity and spatial boundaries in conflicting ways. For example, nearly all minority respondents defined their neighborhood using conventional boundaries like streets and landmarks in a large spatial area that encompassed various racial and socioeconomic groups. This reflected their long-standing intergenerational neighborhood identity. In contrast, white respondents tended to define their neighborhood using unconventional boundaries based on socioeconomic status and perceptions of crime, which excluded areas of lower income and higher shares of minorities. These representations directly feed into relations of networks within residential areas, as well as relations with authorities like police and policymakers. As Eastwood and Smith point out, social norms that maintain racial and ethnic homogeneity in a neighborhood can result in lasting legacies of alienation and discomfort surrounding integration of neighborhood composition. After renewal efforts were conducted in Albina, one of Portland, Oregon's only historically predominantly Black communities, the area saw mass displacement of Black residents. In the words of Joyce Taylor, a long-term resident of and advocate for Albina, the introduction of community gardens was another bad sign for the African American community. We always gardened. We always shared our gardens and our food. We did not need community gardens. That's a white intervention. Green gentrification causes food systems and neighborhood identities to change. Harlem, New York is another valuable case study. Resident Angela Helm writes, "As a young single mother in 1998, Harlem offered me respite, refuge, and safety in my Blackness, as well as an affordable apartment. For me, after working downtown or going to NYU and being picked apart by microaggressions, Harlem was a place where I could blend in and relax." This critical sense of belonging, inclusion, and cultural integrity plays out in interpersonal relations. Despite Harlem's challenges with common violence and its status as a food desert, this was where she found community. However, Helm recalls the first Starbucks opening in 1999, marking the beginning of change. This pattern began further development, skyrocketing rents, white people moving in, and Black people starting to leave in search of affordable housing. In 2017, Whole Foods was built in the center of Harlem. This Whole Foods may be filling a gap for food and helping a few in the process, but the repercussions are far more detrimental to the community as a whole. Green food gentrification has similarly affected residents of an all-Black neighborhood in D.C. As revitalization efforts have improved health qualities, one member says, "We were here when it was a dump, and when it became livable, so to speak, we were not able to stay here and live." Gentrification's investment of wealth and revitalization correlates to higher quality life and important fresh, healthy foods. But the question we must now be asking is who gets to benefit from this increased quality of life? There are also internalized representations and norms of racial power dynamics as grocery stores are implemented. The implicit norm embedded in structural racism over time reinforces Blackness as an antithesis of community health. Drugs and prostitution are framed as inevitable for Black communities, but somehow healthy revitalization of a space requires whiteness. Why can't this be a standard for all communities, regardless of race?
Certain policies historically implemented by the USDA have denied loans to Black and Latino farmers for land, thus limiting land ownership and the acquisition of wealth. From 1940 to 1974, discrimination by the USDA against Black farmers led to a 93% decline in Black farming, as larger operations were provided grants and subsidies and small, family-run style farms of Black individuals were not supported. This decline in Black farming and land ownership, combined with racist policies in housing markets, has been a contributor to persistent inequalities between minority and white land ownership and the overrepresentation of minority individuals in low-income neighborhoods. In the modern real estate market, studies have found proximity to urban green spaces to increase housing prices in many instances. This gives real estate agencies incentive to promote newly greened areas to more affluent buyers, thus driving higher prices and displacement. In a capitalist economic structure like that of the United States, cities seek to rebrand themselves as a means of increasing capital. Exposure to nature, organic food, and fresh produce are perceived as appealing market strategies. A city's desire to demonstrate such assets, combined with the goals of environmental and food justice movements, can lead to revitalization projects, in turn contributing to gentrification. As neighborhoods go richer and whiter, policies have changed to incentivize their development, such as in New York City, where housing policies are rezoning various low-income areas to boost high-density housing. Commercial development and economic incentives such as tax breaks have also been used to lure companies like Whole Foods into these areas. In 3 low-income neighborhoods in Philadelphia, researchers found that nonprofit directors and residents differed in their views of neighborhood problems and needed services. Such misalignment can constrain the ability of programs to practically aid communities by crafting revitalization efforts to improve an area for residents that may instead result in gentrification and the potential for displacement. Another dimension of perception is food mirages, areas where groceries are physically proximal but not affordable or culturally acceptable, creating essentially invisible food deserts, not identified by conventional standards, but just as detrimental for long-term residents. Food justice movement's efforts, while intended to help communities, must grapple with the complexity that their presence appeals to a green lifestyle aesthetic, appealing to more affluent, middle-class, and more white buyers. As this vision of green living is promoted in media and marketing, it can enable representations of green space as white, affluent space, while simultaneously causing erasure of low-income Black urban farming operations. Erasure of Black cultural history has also been threatened by Whole Foods in a campaign that, quote, "collards are the new kale." After Black Americans have been told relentlessly soul food was to blame for obesity, Whole Foods gains legitimacy in representation of collards as a healthy, fresh food, with buy-in from a white audience, allowing them to sell it at higher prices. In the process, Black soul food culture and agency over food choices has been disempowered.